Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you a short sample of the evaluation of sources. There's a few things on Schoology underneath the assignment. There's a sample there from a student last year. There's a video clip, so I don't want to go over and over too many different things, but there were a couple of things during class today that I wanted to touch base with, and we just didn't have enough time. And since I know you want to start working on the assignment, it's due on Friday. So first of all, the evaluation of sources is essentially two OPVLs. Okay, you're taking two of the sources from your bibliography, and you're going to do an evaluation of sources. Only pick two, so you're not doing all 8. That's first. And this should be something that you can do in less than a page. Okay, it is not something that's longer than that. At most, kind of a paragraph, a lengthy paragraph, maybe for each OPVL. The way that this works is, so far you've done the plan of investigation. That is the introduction to what question you're going to be investigating and the purpose of your investigation. Then your second thing is the summary of evidence, where you organized evidence to establish different answers to your question, the evidence that you'll actually consider to answer your question. The evaluation of sources is almost like an extension of your summary of evidence. You're looking to consider, where you got your evidence from, and kind of note the values and limitations of two of the sources of evidence. And ideally, pick two sources that are not exactly the same. Try not to pick two sources that basically make the same argument and are both written by historians, or two primary sources that are both photographs from the same photographer or something like that. Look for perhaps one source on one side of your debate and the other source on the other side of the debate, or find two sources that work well in tandem and maybe build upon each other. One might be a secondary source that offers some context information or kind of hindsight about something that happened a while ago, and a primary source from somebody who was actually at the event, when it took place. Those types of sources can sometimes work well together. Remember, any sources you pick, you should pick kind of your strongest sources, the sources that your topic really hinges on. Try to stay away from your crash course type sources, your Britannica sources, something from like a high school teaching website, something that is for the purpose of scholars is a better source for you guys to work with. It doesn't have to be a whole book. It might be an excerpt from a book. It might be a periodical. It might be something from a museum. Primary source is a variety of really good kind of qualified sources that you might consider. And when you think about your question, ask yourself what types of sources would really be best for my question. Where does it come down to? And if it's an oral history, then look for that type of source. If it's something that an historian can answer using data over time, then that's the type of source to go with. So sometimes it really does depend on your question. The other thing, I'm just going to kind of note a few examples here. The example that I have in front of me is from a student from a while ago, and I'm just using it as an example because it's short. It's a student who is currently a senior. John Ferrante is the student. The question is, to what extent did the failure of Pickett's charge contribute to the defeat of Confederate forces during the Battle of Gettysburg? Okay, so his question is related to the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, and 1863, and we're looking at two of his sources, and his question was, kind of asking about how much Pickett's charge made a difference. He also was looking at alternative arguments, the mistakes made by James Longstreet, who was a Confederate general, and also perhaps the advantages that the Union had in the way that they positioned themselves on top of a particular ridge. Okay, so he was setting up his evidence because he knew in his analysis he was going to be comparing the effects of Pickett's charge with the effects of perhaps other things that happened, and he was going to be kind of weighing what really led the Confederate forces to lose this 3-day Battle of Gettysburg. So his first source, and you can see here, I'm just putting on my glasses and using my little arrow here. You can see his first source is it's primary source in some ways. It's a memoir that's originally written in 1896 by James Longstreet. This is years after the Battle of Gettysburg, so it's not a primary source from the actual battle. It's not that he was present in the battle. He writes it later on, but it also serves as a source where the general kind of defends some of the actions that he took. He kind of writes a memoir because he had been heavily criticized for actions that he took. So we have the student saying the book was first published by James Longstreet, who he was, and he played a noteworthy role in the Battle of Gettysburg. Might even be important to put in here, although it comes up later, that this particular general was, criticized for making a mistake on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. The purpose of the source, this is where the student had put that Longstreet received criticism from a number of other former Confederates, the book was kind of intended to refute these claims. So ultimately, the purpose of the book in this case is very connected to the author of the book and the author's, kind of perception of his own actions in the events of the Battle of Gettysburg. When you guys look at origin, think of the origin as being very connected to the author, and things that might be important is if it's a secondary source. Did this particular person write a book about your topic? Do they teach and have a specialty in this topic? Is this something that they have some degree of expertise? If they're a generalist in a lot of things, then they're not necessarily a good quality source. So if you find a good quality source, you want to sell that source a little bit in your origin, okay? The purpose is very much connected to, the purpose of the source itself in the time it was created. What was the purpose of the source? For value and limitation, which is the much more significant, aspect of the OPVL, really focus on the value and the limitation. You're interested in, the value to your particular question. And if you consider in this, Longstreet possessed insight. He was at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was able to, kind of understand an insight into the factors that contributed to the outcome of the battle. We also know his account of the event is very, very valuable for that reason. He also is able to talk about Pickett's charge, and he was very critical of Pickett's charge. He didn't want this to happen, so Longstreet's, kind of say on Pickett's charge is also very important. And so for the student to say that would be key. So there's a few things that are valuable. The student in the limitation goes back to purpose. So this is the main thing I wanted to kind of note in class. If you start to have trouble with value and limitation, spend a little time thinking about your origin and purpose. The value and limitation are often found within the origin and within the purpose. In this case, it's the limitation for the source is related to the purpose. Because this general created this source as a defense, in a sense, for his own reputation, the source itself, has to consider that particular action. And it doesn't mean that the source stories about Pickett charge aren't important. That's still valuable. This guy was there and he was critical of General Lee, calling Pickett's charge and all of that. But at the same time, because this source is coming from a place where it's defensive in nature, the purpose itself is the limitation. And for limitation, you can also look at the origin. Perhaps your particular source is a website that is developed as a museum website, and the museum website has text on it that you're going to be using as a source. The text may be very, very short, because a museum website often has, short descriptive type blurbs and maybe short essays that are appropriate for public or student consumption. There might not be really lengthy scholarly articles on that website if it's part of an exhibit or something like that. So sometimes the origin of the source or the purpose that it serves are connected to the value and limitation, okay? Especially when we're looking at limitations. A lot of you are putting as limitations things like the source is biased, right? That's not specific enough. You would have to actually use evidence from the source itself to be convincing that there's a particular type of bias. All sources are biased. It's also not reasonable to just say a source leaves out something, right? A source that's secondary can't be faulted because it's not a primary source, right? It's a secondary source. What about the secondary source is limiting? So look kind of at the source itself. If you expect something to be in the source and it's not, you can note that, but you can't really say a source about World War I is faulty because it doesn't have, World War II in it, right? It's something like that is more of a general statement that's not really a fair limitation. It's a weak limitation, okay? So, really kind of think of the purpose and the origin as key for you to examine, are your values connected to the origin? Is the author so spectacular that that's what you're getting? Is the story the author's telling, really important to understanding your topic? Is it related to the origin? Is it related to the purpose? Is the limitation related to the origin? Is it related to the purpose? The other thing to think about is the type of source it is. Photographs, for example, are naturally limiting because they're interpretive and they capture, one moment in time, but not necessarily, the rest of the context. Lots of sources, just because of the nature of the way that they're constructed, are limiting, okay? But it's not necessarily the case that because one source isn't another type of source, it's a limitation. Lastly, we'll just kind of look at one other example, and this is, I can post this on Schoology. You can look at the student's OPVL. But I wanted to also just showcase an example of a value and limitation. This student is being scored by an IB grader. And so this looks a little bit different, but this student said that their question is, to what extent did World War II lead to women in the United States becoming permanent participants of the labor force? And so this might be a question where they're looking at, this Rosie the Riveter story. How much did women gain jobs during World War II and then stay in the labor force, like in the 1950s or whatever? And they're looking at, 1940 to 1950. How much of that, that war ends in 1945, so that extra 5-year time period, do women stay in the labor force? So you might even ask yourself initially, what would be a good source for this, right? Probably going to be looking at some statistical data about women's employment rates. If they increased, did they stay, or did they increase and then decrease? And what might that be? The very first source that the student is going to look at is Julia Kirk Blackwelder's book, The Feminization of Work in the United States, written in 1997. The origin of this source is valuable because, so this student already is connecting kind of origin, and she's listed the origin, so we have the name of the book, but why is it valuable? The origin of the source is valuable because Blackwelder's a professor of history at Texas University, specializing in modern U.S. and American women's history, has written extensively on women's employment in scholarly journals and books, indicating that she is knowledgeable on the topic. Okay, so in some way, the source origin is in its own right, a value because we have the right person talking about this topic. Okay, there's also this mention of hindsight. Historical secondary sources, oftentimes that happen way after an event, have an advantage of having the ability to collect data, access other historians. A source from the 1940s itself, from a woman who was a worker, is interesting because it might tell a certain story, but it doesn't necessarily give us some insight into a whole bunch of data or into what other historians have suggested. So just noting that secondary sources benefit from hindsight. That's useful. I think there could be more here with an example. So that's like me looking at this student's work. This becomes a little bit more general, something that you could plop onto any evaluation of sources that uses a secondary source, and that's not necessarily as strong as having something that's very specific to your question. So here in this next one, the purpose of the book is to analyze the trends of American women's employment in 1900 to 1955 to let evidence speak for itself. This is valuable, and there's a couple of reasons. The fact that the author has covered nearly a century of economic developments, limits his value, because we're only looking at this 10-year time period, and so this book is covering, nearly 100 years of the time period. This student is having a conversation about the pros and cons of using this source, okay? The second source is an address, which is a primary source, so we see the student kind of making a careful calculation of different types of sources, one with statistical data from an historian, one from somebody who is addressing the American Economic Association in 1944, and the name of the speech is The Post-War Role of American Women. So it fits into the topic, the question well, because we're looking at, what is likely to happen with the role of women in the labor force. The origin of the source is valuable because it was delivered by the head of the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor, so somebody who was involved in, understanding the plight of women and employment during this time. And the date of the delivery is suggesting, that she would understand, kind of toward the end of the war, this time period, and what was happening with women. The date is also a limitation because, it doesn't cover that 1945 to 1950, time period, and so there is some issues with the date. Okay, you could certainly use the date as part of the origin of the source. That is significant. In terms of origin, the source is also limited in that she was herself a former factory worker, so there's some suggestion that maybe she could be biased, okay? So you can let this be the case. You can say that she might have had her views shaped. It's not necessarily a given, right? If you can use a quote or suggest somewhere in the source where it does seem like she is particularly well attuned,